Ladies and gentlemen, Colorado, 15 deaf people. We saw just next to my doorstep in Winnenden, Germany, 16 deaf person. And we saw in Norway, Utøya, 67 deaf person. So what we see, please don't misunderstand our proposition. We believe in personal freedom of every person in a state governed by law and every person in a democracy. But what we see, ladies and gentlemen, in the major task of the government is that some people seem to not understand what personal freedom really is. And if we see one person killing 67 children just because of some weird political opinions, we see that this person is not capable of respecting personal freedom, and this person actually has to also be infringed in his freedom. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's debate or discuss about whether or not certain crimes should be actually punished through a lifelong imprisonment without any chance of release, ladies and gentlemen. So, to my structure in today's, as long as I'm the government speaker, the government prime minister in today's debate, I'm going to structure my speech by at first stating what side of the proposition actually is standing for today, and secondly, giving my own substantive speech. So let me start with what we are actually standing for today. We define at first lifelong imprisonment as imprisonment without any chance of release till your death. Secondly, we're going to define this house as only states governed by law, because what we see is otherwise we actually shouldn't be incapable of debating that debate, because if we talk about actually autocracies where people actually get punished for no real crimes, this is a problem of the society and not of the actual justice system we want to implement in it. So, and lastly, we define actually the most important term, certain crimes, as following. We define these crimes as crimes affecting and infringing individual freedom of huge parts of society, such as multiple murderers and serial killers, and for example also demagogic propaganda that huge parts of society get, for example, driven to an opinion which is infringing huge freedom for the individual in that society. Ladies and gentlemen, that directly leads me to the model we want to implement to secure that our values and definitions are perfectly fitting into society. At first, we want to that this decision on a lifelong imprisonment has to be made by the highest possible justice instance, for example, the Supreme Court. And in addition, we want to have this decision made in addition with a combination of an ethic commission to ensure the moral legitimacy, and secondly, a psychologist commission, which ensuring that these people can't be re-socialized and actually can't fit into our society because of several problems in their minds. So, ladies and gentlemen, after I dealt with that, please let me come to our case. What side propositions today standing for? No, thank you, sir. So, we as side proposition strongly believe that the major task of every government is the security of the majority of the population. And what we see is that in the social contract, this is actually stated that the individual freedom of one person ends with the freedom of another person starts. And what we see is that therefore it's at first justified, and secondly it even benefits society if we imprison people lifelong. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to establish that through three major arguments. The first one I will deal with is legitimacy of lifelong imprisonment, and this second argument my second speaker will deal with is the economic benefits, and the third argument also my second speaker will deal with that is the benefits for society. Ladies and gentlemen, so at last, what side proposition sees in the burden of side opposition is that we see that they can prove to us that in the status quo they are actually fighting for, we have a secure society, and a society where everybody is safe from crimes which are infringing so many people in our society, ladies and gentlemen. So let me come to my own substantive speech. What we see, as I told you, my argument is mainly the legitimacy of lifelong imprisonment. I will answer that by three major questions I asked myself at the beginning of today's debate. First one, First one, what is actually the government's role? Secondly, what are the aims of imprisonment? And third, the link to our case and the link to our motion. So let me start with the first main question of my substantive speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that we have the social contract by Rousseau, by Hobbes, and by Voltaire. This is the actual fundament of the Western societies, which is stating the following sentences a sentence that the individual freedom of one person just goes as far as another individual freedom of another person is not infringed. So what we see is the major task of every government should be the security of the individual freedom of the majority of cases. So, yes, please.
Well, if you think that these people are committing crimes that infringe on so many people's rights, if what they've done is so bad, why would we expend so many resources to get them fed, clothed, and sheltered in a jail?
So, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that therefore the major task. What we see is that you can't just take the freedom of a person by just putting him into a jail, by actually imprisoning that person. But what we see is that he still has the right to live from our constitution. But we have to just imprison him so far. We have to take his freedom so far that he is not capable to infringe the freedom of others. So, for example, we are actually strongly against death penalty, or we furthermore see it because we see that we can't take so much freedom of the person, but we have to just infringe the freedom as far as everybody else in the society is secure from his potential threat against everybody else. So what we see, even if what we also see in the potential threat against society, is if he becomes free, as he won't commit any crime anymore, even though people are scared that he will do it again. This is also infringement of personal rights. If you, for example, can't go to a cinema or anything without actually being scared that somebody commits a crime on you. And we also see that, that social contract in our example of hard drugs. So we also just taking away personal freedom to insecure the freedom of the whole society that not other people also doing drugs, because this is actually not important. No, thank you, sir. So let me come to my second question, what are the actual aims of imprisonment? The first one is general prevention. The second one is resourcialization. General prevention, I just answered my question before. This is about the security of the society, that you just secure all the other persons. This potential threat against society could commit a crime again. This is just actually the essence of the social contract, as I said it before. So the second part is important. This is resourcialization. And as I told you, we believe in personal rights. No, thank you. And we believe that certain people can be resourcialized, ladies and gentlemen. But what we see is that in the sense that what we see is that some people can find their way back to society, that people can be resourcialized, and we see, for example, that in Germany, 10 to 20% in the last 20 years actually committed crimes again after they came out of prison. So what we see in a sense is that if people can be resourcialized, and we're going to prove that through the commission of psychologists and through the commission of ethics professors, we want actually to implement deciding whether or not these people should be in prison lifelong, that this is actually justified. And what we see is that they can be resourcialized. The only major task of imprisonment, which is that, is general prevention. Therefore, we should secure the society and infringe the freedom of other persons. Let me come to the last question I want to ask you, which is pretty small. So what we see is, if the major task of the people, the government, is to secure as much as possible individual freedom in society, but some people are infringing the individual freedom of other people so much that we have to take the freedom of those, ladies and gentlemen, and they can't be resourcialized, and they actually can't stick to our society. We have to just take them back from society and secure the life of so many people. Ladies, in my summary, I just showed you one major argument about the legitimacy, which first from the task of society, secondly the aims of imprisonment, and thirdly the link to our case. Therefore, we stand proud in our proposition, and we stand proud in a secure society. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Just a second. We will now call for the first speaker of Team Opposition to deliver his substantive and logical.
show you why this resolution must and will fall, and we're here to show you why what we think proposition is proposing today is actually not feasible. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the stance we're going to take on opposition today is we've seen them talk about all the horrible crimes they're talking about. We've seen them talk about how they think life imprisonment without parole is a justified stance. But what we're actually going to argue today on our position is that this is not enough. We're actually going to argue on opposition that life without parole is not a good enough punishment for the crimes they're talking about. We're going to argue that these crimes merit capital punishment. That is the only thing that's actually justified enough for these criminals. And so we are actually going to argue that proposition is not proposing enough today. Capital punishment is the only justified way to deal with these criminals. So with that in mind, we set two burdens for ourselves today, and we think in proving these two things, we're actually going to be able to prove that we have won this debate. So number one, we say we have to prove that capital punishment achieves more adequate justice than life imprisonment, and that number two, that life imprisonment isn't practically feasible. Before I get into the constructive matter today, let's take a quick look, however, at what side proposition has told us so far. So the first big idea we've seen from proposition today is this idea of a model. And today, in this model, we've seen this idea about a Supreme Court and Ethics Commission determining whether people should do this or not. However, they've also talked about how horrible these crimes are, and we've POI'd from side opposition and asked if you think these crimes are so horrible and so horrid, and you think they can't contribute back to society, I'll take you in a second, that all they can do is stay in jail. Yes?
We have to maintain the dignity of the prisoners to some certain extent. We cannot just provide them any basic living means because of the crime that they committed.
Well, we actually think that the crimes you're talking about, like the mass murders that you used in your definition, are such horrific crimes that we don't actually think it's justified that they're allowed to remain in jail for life. And furthermore, we don't actually think it's fair that society is now going to have to continue to pay to support these criminals in jail. This moves on to the second big idea we actually saw from proposition today, and that was this admittance that if the ethics committee would put them in jail under their model, it's because they've actually determined that these individuals cannot be rehabilitated, cannot go back into society, cannot contribute to society anymore. So we'd say if you've already determined that they're not going to help society, we don't see in any way why you're going to hurt society further by making society support these criminals in jail for the rest of their life.
Sir.
So now I'm going to move on to my constructive case and show you the three main arguments that we've actually got for you on opposition today. The first two ideas I'm going to talk about are number one, the preventative, and number two, the closure for victims. My partner Ben, our third speaker today, is then going to go on to talk about the principled economic side of this argument. So let's move into this first argument and look through the preventative at this idea of goals of the prison system. So we see that there are three main basic goals of every prison system in society: retribution, rehabilitation, and restoration. So we've already established that both sides here understand that neither of these plans are going to achieve retribution and rehabilitation. We've already understood that there's no way these criminals can possibly get back to society. Yes?
You still have the dignity of the person. And if you're, for example, you're talking about that so hard crimes related, it's not justice, just taking the life of one person and rebuild it, because you don't fight fire with fire, right?
Well, we actually think the crimes you're talking about, these huge mass murders, we don't actually think it's appropriate to represent the dignity of these people. We think we're talking about people that have killed hundreds of other individuals. We don't think it's fair to then respect their dignity, and furthermore, to actually place the burden on society to make society support them for the crimes that they have caused. Now, moving on with this case, we understand that the main goal being debated here is retribution. And the main question we have to ask ourselves is which alternative is actually going to offer the best form of retribution for these criminals. What we're going to prove today is that death penalty is the only way to have acceptable retribution for these individuals.
Sir.
There's a principle and a practical side to this argument. We'd say, first of all, on principle, when you restrict somebody else's rights in society, yours deserve to be restricted too. And we think for crimes like this, you actually need the highest form of restriction and the highest form of retribution possible. So on principle, we think that the highest level is not still keeping these individuals alive with the exercise, the food, the amenities that are in jails. We think that all people also have an inherent fear of death, because principally, the basic goal of the human race is to survive and to carry on. We think death is the most final, complete, and absolute penalty, and we think that in these cases, it's actually justified. So in life imprisonment, when an individual is in jail, we see that they've actually still got things in some societies like healthcare benefits, food and water, clothing, resources, showers, electricity. we don't actually think life in jail as horrible as it needs to be to justify the actions of these criminals.
Sir?
We also think that there's a practical side to this argument, and we actually think that's if people are more afraid of the death penalty, they're going to be disincentivized to commit crime. I've already talked about how death penalty is the most complete, most final, and most absolute version of crime. What we're actually proposing on side opposition today is that what Proposition is talking about isn't effective enough deterrent for the individuals that are going to be committing these crimes, and that we think the death penalty is actually going to act as a more effective deterrent because it's so final, because it is so complete and absolute. The final contention we have today is this idea that there is no justice for the victims, and that's going to be my second big part of argumentation today. Essentially what we're going to argue here is that as long as the individuals committing the crimes are actually still alive and still in the jail system, we don't actually think that the victims and the families of these crimes have been justified. So we think in many cases severe crimes result in severe harms and severe miscarriage of justice for the victims. We think their friends and family have lost somebody forever. They're never going to interact with these individuals again. Even when an individual is in life imprisonment, in some systems, they're still going to have the opportunity to receive visitors. They're still going to have the amenities in jail that I talked about. So we don't really think that there's appropriate justification for the families who have instead lost their loved ones, lost their lives, and now still have to live with the thought that these individuals are still out there. The second part of this argument is that in doing this, we're actually trying to minimize the weight in the back of the mind of the people who are actually talking about this. What we're essentially trying to do is minimize the mental impact of the victims. We want to make them, we don't want to place any extra mental burdens on them than we have to. So we think that as long as these people are actually still alive, still out there, even if we're in a prison, we don't think this justice has been served appropriately. We don't think it's right to have individuals who have been victims have to go to sleep every night knowing that the killer is still out there, still alive, and still receiving food, water, and showers. So ladies and gentlemen, we think this problem is actually further worsened by the fact that the victims' tax dollars are now going to go towards supporting these victims. I've referenced this throughout the case, and that's going to be the bulk of the third point you see from side opposition today. But it's because of these three contentions we believe it's so important. I've talked to you today about the first two, this idea of preventative, the goals of the prison system, and how we think that both on a principled and a practical level, this is the most justified and most complete form of retribution. And then I've talked about this idea that there really is no justice for the victims as long as that individual is still alive. We think in order to have complete justice and to have the victims completely mentally satisfied, that these individuals have to take capital action. So ladies and gentlemen, it's for these reasons today, and the reasons we're going to continue to bring up, that we truly believe this must fall, and we're coming to you with the case line today: life in jail is doomed to fail. Thank you.
Okay, we now call for the second Speaker of Community Government to present her substantive rebuttal in written.
Ladies and gentlemen, the dignity of a person is untouchable. This is the main point on what our Constitution is based on. And this is what we as a government see, that, and what we as a government can't accept that the state kills a person, because this, ladies and gentlemen, is against the Constitution, and the government simply can't do that. So welcome the second time from side proposition to today's debate. I'm the second speaker, and today I'm just going to do my rebuttal, and after that come to my own substantive speech, in which I will talk about the economical benefits and the benefits we see for the society as well. So let me first of all start off with my rebuttal. First of all, I will talk about their point on the capital punishment, and after that I will rebuild our principles and our practical model. So let me first off start with their point of the capital punishment. Well, what they actually said, what they pointed out was that the most effective way they see is to punish those people who commit that bad crimes with capital punishment. But ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that we as a government, that the government doesn't have the right to take to kill people, no thank you, to kill people and to take people's lives away, because this is what our constitution is based on, as I already pointed out in my introduction. And the only job that we said Proposition today see that the government has is actually to make sure that the security of the society is assured. And no, thank you. That the security of the society is assured. And as my first speaker already pointed out, this is definitely given with our model. But I will also come to this later on in my speech. So what we see is that our basic principle is, ladies and gentlemen, is, as my first speaker already pointed out, that the freedom of one person ends where the freedom of the other person begins. So what we are trying to do as a proposition is to still respect and maintain the dignity of the imprisoned people, because we see that this is just a main principle of our constitution. But what we also see is that we have to assure, because the security of the people living in our society, because otherwise, no thank you, this would be an infringement in their freedom. So what we see is that therefore we have to make sure that they can never get out of prison, that they stay there for the rest of their life, no thank you, because this is an effective way to assure the security of the people, and therefore actually this is something that goes against the whole second point of them, with the victims being scared and can't sleep because they think that the murderer is still walking outside and being free and can can commit crimes again. But ladies and gentlemen, if the murderer, the person that committed the crime, the criminal, if he stays in prison for the rest of his life, he actually has no possibility, has no possibility to do anything again. And therefore, we as a proposition today, we assure the security in our society, but still at the same point, we still maintain the dignity of the imprisoned person, which is very important, ladies and gentlemen. Because what we still see is that in prison, the people, they still have the basic living standards, and they still keep their dignity, which they don't if we would have capital punishment, if we would have death penalty, then this would be against our constitutional thank you, which we as a government really can't accept. So the only thing that we want to make sure as a government is that that we take as many rights away of the person as we can by putting them in prison for the rest of their life. So we take as many rights away as we see is still morally acceptable for us as a government, with the constitution we are based on the one hand, but still on the other hand, in this way we can make sure that the security of the people living in our society is assured, and that they can live in our society without having any threat or anything. And this is what we as a government today stand for, that this is the main job of the government. And we see this clearly fulfilled with our model, which I will now rebuild. So, ladies and gentlemen, in our model, we still respect the main dignity, which is very important, because this is a basic point of our constitution, because we see that everybody has the right for a fair trial. So what we assure, thank you, is that the trial goes to the Supreme Court, that we have the ethical committee with checks on it, and psychologists that ensure that this person actually can't be re-socialized in our society, to make sure that it is legitimate on a moral basis and on a legal basis. So therefore, we assure everybody a fair trial, which is, with which we maintain the dignity of this criminal and still assure the security for our society, ladies and gentlemen. So let me now come to my own substantive speech. First of all, I will talk about the economic benefits, and after that about benefits for our society. So what we see is that what I'm going to talk about now is the economic solution which is still respecting the dignity of a person, because we see, as I've already pointed out in my rebuttal, that the government has no right to kill any people, because in our constitution we say that the dignity of a person is untouchable. So what I'm going to present now is the best economic solution, which is still respecting the dignity of the criminal, what that opposition definitely doesn't do today. So what we see is that the criminals, they can, at the moment, they can get life imprisonment for like 50 times or something, but they still have the right to probation. So what we see, if they get released from the government, they actually require people that look after them, that check on them, that see that they don't stick to their restriction orders and so on, like probation officers or state officers. And so the government has to pay their wages. So this creates huge costs for our environment, for our state. And additionally, thank you, this, the trial causes costs as well. So what we see is that those costs are not justified, first on a moral basis, because this person has committed a crime and we don't see why we should pay these costs and thankfully let him go free again. And the other point is that he still is a threat for society, and therefore we don't see that the costs for letting him free are justified, as long as he's still a threat for the society, since the government's main job is to maintain the security of the society. So what I'm going to show you now is that the prison costs we would have are actually overweighing. I'm not overweighing the costs that we have the person free, because in prison we only have to like pay for the food and stuff. But if we have the person working on free, and if we're releasing her, we have to pay for the trials, to cause this, and for the prevention officers and so on. So what we see is that this is not justified if then the person still has a possibility and is still a possible threat to the society, and can still possible harm people in our society, which therefore is not reassuring the security. So the second point would be the benefits for our society. What we see is, of course, our model still assures the security for the people without taking away the dignity of the criminal, and therefore it's the best possible solution, respecting the dignity of the people and respecting and assuring the security. So ladies and gentlemen, for all those reasons, please vote positive today, and please respect the dignity of the criminals. Thank you.
Okay, we now call for the second speaker of the opposition to deliver this substantive rebuttal and refutation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges, worthy opponents, and esteemed colleagues. Today, we're here to discuss the question of life imprisonment without parole. And here on side opposition, we brought forth the idea of capital punishment. Now, before I get into my substantive speech, I'd like to quickly offer some rebuttal and reveal some of what Hartnett brought up in his first speech. Now, we saw coming from side opposition quite a bit of the idea of dignity, and the idea of keeping in prisoners' dignity. Yet we don't see the effect of keeping in prisoners' dignity. In reality, what we're doing is violating the dignity of the victim, the people who actually still support society, by allowing people who harm them or harm their family members to stay alive in prison while they support them with their tax dollars, and we don't see how they can justify this. They also brought up the idea that in the Constitution, the main principle is that the government shouldn't kill other people. But we don't see how they actually prove this by bringing up which constitution they meant. And we'd like to remind them that all countries' constitutions are provided on this time. And now we also see that on this time. Thank you. They also talked about the idea that it's not fair to pay to release these criminals. Yet we say yes, it's not fair to pay to release criminals, so we don't want to do it either. We think they should be served capital punishment. Not this time, thank you. They said that in prison the costs aren't quite as bad because you only have to pay for food, when in reality the costs in prison are much worse and actually put the government in debt and put more prisoners in the prisons. we see that it costs $40,000 a person in the United States per prisoner to keep them in there.
Point, sir.
$40,000 per person a week. And we see that is a ridiculous amount of money to make the government spend on someone who has no interest in helping the government. And since side proposition never wants to help them to release them or rehabilitate them, so they actually at one point do support society again, not this time, thank you. Never do support society again. We don't see how it's fair that we make these that we spend all this money on people who have no desire to help us. Now, they also want to talk about security and how these people are kept in prison their entire lives. Everyone else is safe. Everyone else is secure. So what we actually see, not this time, thank you, is that they're not actually as safe as side proposition might have you believe. Yes, they're in prisons. Yes, that is a guarded environment, but escape is always an option. We see that with capital punishment, escape isn't exactly an option. Ladies and gentlemen, because they're dead. Not this time, thank you. We see that with keeping them in prison, yes, it seems secure because they're in prison. We see that escape isn't exactly the most uncommon thing in prison systems, and that they all have their flaws. And with the amount of time they're spending in there, they're actually getting more time to learn the flaws and be able to exploit them. This is a point I'd like to further develop in my constructive speech a little later. Now, a partner also, not this time, thank you, a partner Lloyd also brought up the idea that we're actually not respecting the families and we're giving them the moral basis. But what they said is that they tried to interpret this as what we were saying is the families would be scared. But what we were more trying to bring forth is the idea that the mental impact on the families, and that knowing there is no proper retribution for the crimes that were committed against them, and no proper punishment. We see that the mental impact, not this time, thank you, is too detrimental for these people to actually allow it to happen while we let the prisoners live in relative comfort.
Point, sir.
Yes?
How can you say that, for example, for a family, it's not enough that they know that the freedom of a person gets so highly infringed that he can't develop himself right, he can't develop himself right, but his dignity is still worthy. So they see that government don't fight fire with fire, but still infringes a person's rights.
Well, we see that we say that these people have their rights infringed, and they have their freedoms infringed, and we see that life in prison doesn't actually infringe the majority of the freedoms, and that these prisons, with the amount of time they spend there, can actually abuse the system quite a bit. I like to bring the example of Clifford Olson. Clifford Olson was a serial killer. He murdered and raped children in Canada. And what happened was Clifford Olson was sentenced to life in prison without parole. What happened to Clifford Olson? He abused the system and got his retirement pension in prison. He received the money the government would give to every other citizen, including the victims of the families in prison, and was able to support himself that way and buy things that other prisoners have. And what we see is this isn't restricting his freedoms. He's getting freedoms that he shouldn't have in prison with life and parole. And we see that because of this, what they're doing isn't actually accomplishing what they say it should be. Now, I'd like to move on to my constructive case. What I'd like to talk to you about is about economics, and not this time, thank you, and prove to you that despite what proposition says about just being more economic, they're actually wrong. What we're doing is hurting not only society, but the government. No, thank you. We see that society has no responsibility to help economically people who have no desire to help them and have actually harmed them in effect. We see that in prison, all prisoners are supported by society. They live in prison for free. They get free meals, free clothes, showers, accommodation. Not this time, thank you. And in most cases, if they're hurt, they get medical services and doctors. What we see is that they're living. They're not living. No, thank you. No, thank you. With their freedoms restricted, what happens is they're living in a society where society is supporting them. And not only are these tax dollars from every single person in society, there's also tax dollars that come from the victims. Not this time, thank you. What we see is the victims are actually supporting the people who harmed them. Now, we don't see how it's fair, how it's morally justifiable to ask the victims to support the people who harmed them so greatly. Not this time, thank you. What we see is that because of this, we're actually doing this with detrimenting society. We're putting this burden, as my partner talked about, on victims. Not this time, thank you. Now, as I brought up earlier, Clifford Olson, who abused the system. We see that this isn't actually restricting the freedoms, as I brought up earlier. Like they talked about, what we're doing is actually giving them an opportunity where they can exploit the freedom due to the amount of time they're spending in there. We see that because they're spending all this time in there, like Clifford Olson spent, we see that they actually have more time than other prisoners do to abuse the system. I also see the side proposition, not this time, thank you, has no interest in reforming them, has no interest in putting them back into society. What we're doing is actually just supporting these people for the rest of their lives in the idea of retribution. Not actually not this time, thank you. And we feel that because of this, what we're actually doing is better for the prisoners than the family, and we don't see how that's morally justifiable. No. Yes?
Would you also argue that criminals who committed less crimes, less severe crimes, are also should not be supported by the state because they don't contribute back to society and don't care about society?
Well, you brought that up, and I don't think that's true. Because what you're talking about is like the parole. Smaller crimes that actually have the opportunity to go back and reintegrate society, they have the opportunity to be reformed. They have the opportunity to go back to society and pay taxes, maybe study business, and try and help society as a whole. The prisoners that don't have the option for parole and are going to stay there for the rest of their lives have no opportunity to integrate with society. They have no opportunity to reform or to help anyone in society. They're not going to help anyone, and they have no desire to reform. What we'll see is that what we're discussing here is retribution. We're ignoring the two other principles, restoration and reintegration, that my partner brought up in his speech, and we're talking about retribution. And that we feel our form of retribution is the most effective, the single most effective, because what we're doing is we're helping society, we're helping the victims, and we're helping the government, as I'd like to talk about now. What we see is that the government is in a huge economic crisis, or internationally, governments are feeling deficit. What we see is that because of this, the money we're wasting on prisoners who like us, who have no desire of reforming, have no desire of helping us, is actually being misused. And we see that the $400,000 per person figure that we see in America isn't just there, it's international. We see that what this is people, countries, and governments all around the world are wasting their money on people who have no desire to help them. We see that they're wasting their money on people who that we feel could be dealt with capital punishment in a more effective way that would not only benefit them, but the rest of society, and most importantly the victims and the families of those who were victims. What we see is because of this, our model is actually presenting the best solution to provide the retribution we're discussing here today. Now, it's because of this, we'd like to remind you that life in jail, ladies and gentlemen, is doomed to fail. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all. Okay, ending the constructive speeches on the side proposition, we call for the speaker.
We found it much rather funny that side opposition decided to argue the motion this House believes that life imprisonment is the highest punishment. So what we see here is that they completely lacked on actually talking about the motion that in fact states that this House believes that the same crimes, that some crimes with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole is an appropriate is the appropriate punishment. What we see is they clearly lack is in stating why the parole is necessary for the people, for those prisoners, and why they need that, and why without that it isn't an appropriate punishment. What we see is they completely failed on talking about what this motion was in fact about in the first place, and therefore we see that because of that point, and because of the side proposition has been arguing and has been showing you that without the possibility of parole is in fact still a legitimate and appropriate punishment, that therefore we have already basically won the debate on that, based on the fact that we did in fact stick to the debate and to the motion as a whole. Moving on to my rebuttal, which I split up into 3 different points, which is A, I will first state on why in fact supporting the dignity of the prisoner is legit and why we can still have an appropriate punishment with the possibility of parole. Now notice, judges, that I will still stick to this motion because I do not see why we should be debating on the death penalty, as we see that we should be talking about whether or not life imprisonment is an appropriate punishment with or without the parole. Moving on to, I'll still, though, further attack the death penalty because we see that that is not completely legitimate at all, as my second speaker has stated in her rebuttal. And then I'll move on to the fact of the relatives and the economic burden that we see here. Let me first state that our big principles were in fact basically the same on both sides. Why? Because we stated we stood here for the security of the people, which was in fact our side. What we saw here is that the side opposition completely failed on attacking on why saying that parole is such a huge, such a mandatory thing that we should have, such a mandatory right that it should be given to the prisoners for it to become an appropriate punishment. Moving on to the dignity of the prisoners. They stated that, well, for these people who have committed these crimes, in fact, it is not legitimate to, in fact, provide them with basic living standards. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, we're living in Western societies, and as my first speaker stated in his definition, we're talking about countries where, in fact, are ruled by law. So what we see here is that, in those countries, we're not animals, ladies and gentlemen. We have evolved through society, and we've seen that death penalty is, in fact, not our right, and not our right as government to take away the lives of other people. Why? Because as my first speaker and my second speaker stated, you do not fight fire with fire. We see that in fact, most of the constitutions of Western societies, and even in fact Canada, do in fact stand for the dignity of the people. As we see that the German Constitution, the First Amendment in there is in fact that the dignity of a person is untouchable. What we see is that we must, even though they have committed these horrific crimes, we must provide them with some sort of dignity and some basic living standards. Why? Because in fact, like I stated, we're not some animals, and we're talking about states that are ruled by law here. Moving on to their model of the death penalty. Now, this is a model that we have seen, and that nowadays is in fact being taken away from most of the countries. And why, ladies and gentlemen? Because in fact, we said that is not legitimate for a government to take away the lives of a person. Who, in fact, is a government to be taking away the life of a person who murders other people? We do see that the government cannot state this and cannot stand there as a government who sees everybody equal and still take away the lives. How, as a government, are you going to propose or impose the values? It's like a parent, ladies and gentlemen. If you lie, you're lying. You can't teach your child not to lie. If you're killing the people, you can't say that they shouldn't kill. That's being a hypocrite. That's being a hypocrite, ladies and gentlemen. So what we stand for here is that we as a government cannot stand here and say, yes, life, the death penalty is in fact legit. Because we see that. Furthermore, in Canada, it's also not legit. And so we see that, in fact, in Germany as well, most Western societies do not have a death penalty. As we see that there has also been a decreasing of the death penalty in the United States because more and more states in the United States are doing that. Moving on to the principle that we further agreed on was ensuring security. We saw here that you can just ensure security by having them imprisoned. Why? Because that means that A, they're in fact imprisoned, and I don't think that opposition got this law, because what that means is that they're in prison, that their life is in prison, because they have no peril, because of the fact that, well, as we stated in our model, you have a legal and a moral commission. You have the legal basis, which is like maybe the Supreme Court and so on, as my first speaker stated, and the moral, which is the ethic commission that both decide whether or not this prisoner has committed such a severe crime that they must have life imprisonment. So if they, in fact, both of them agree to the same point, saying that yes, in fact, this crime was severe enough for them to have life imprisonment for the rest of their life, then they're stated there, and they're ensuring the security of the population. Why? Because this criminal is, in fact, not a touch of the society at all. So what we're reaching here is basically the same result as they wanted to reach with their death penalty, but being more, we're giving the dignity to these prisoners, but not being animals, by being a civilized state, ladies and gentlemen. And that's exactly what we're standing for here today. Furthermore, we asked if they would argue that, well, why would we provide them with basic needs such as water and so on? And they stated that because they don't want to give back to society, why should society be giving to them? We asked the question that, well, clearly there are a lot of severe crimes committed, right? And they obviously don't care about society because they committed some kind of crime, whether it was financial or whatever, and so on. So why should we return to them back in the first place? If they would want to impose this entire thing about not providing to the prisoner because they committed a crime, because they don't care about society, so society shouldn't care about them, then in fact we would have to take away our whole system as a whole, and we see that in fact, how are they able to decide once again which person is in fact severe enough to do a death penalty and to have in fact be penalized by death and which not? We have seen no clear model on how are they going to decide on which crime is severe enough to take away the lives of the other person and which not. Whereas we, on the other hand, as side proposition today, have proven our model based on the two basic steps that we've had, which was A, the legal one, that first has to decide what based on laws and so on, if this was a severe crime, if it was a first, second, third degree murder, and the second part, which was the moral part, where we had psychologists and people who know about the moral issues actually state and think whether or not this person was influenced by some kind of, take it a second, sir, was influenced by some kind of other needs in their head because of some disorder, some syndrome, and so on. Yes, sir.
If you think this moral social security is so important, why do you think it's okay that you have these people that commit mass murders still be in jail but alive?
Thank you, sir. Exactly. What we see here is that we feel that once again we must support the dignity of this person. We once again see that in fact we must give them the chance to see if they have a psychological disorder. We're not going to solve this problem by just putting them in prison. We must give them a chance to also have psychological treatment and so on. We furthermore see that in fact only if these two decide together that then we can impose the life imprisonment without possibility of peril. Because we see that those 2 points are critical as a whole. Moving on to the last 2 parts, which was the relative and the economic burden. freedom of living free. And we see that through life imprisonment, they're also the same thing. The last point, which is the economical burden. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in society where we put dignity upon economical burden. And that's where we see that, once again, we are no animals. Ladies and gentlemen, for the fact that we argued the motion, for the fact that we stuck to the motion and proved why the possibility of peril is an appropriate measure, and why we showed that the dignity of the prisoners must be respected, for all those reasons, we're proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now call for the last substantive speaker of this debate, third speaker in opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this heated debate today, we've seen a proposition team that is willing to sacrifice the mental and economic security of the state in order to give people who have committed horrific crimes the kind of dignity that they have died to so many people in our society. Whereas you've seen an opposition team that, unlike what proposition team seems to say, that we have addressed what the motion about. The motion is about whether or not we think that life imprisonment is an adequate punishment. We don't think that it's an adequate punishment. Our job is to prove that their model is not going to work, and we have proved that. And so, with our two burdens, that capital punishment achieves more adequate justice than life imprisonment, and life imprisonment isn't practically feasible. And now to show you how we approve these two things, I'm going to really boil this debate down into three main questions. First of all, does the government have the right to inflict capital punishment? The second one, does capital punishment lead to societal security? And finally, is capital punishment economically feasible? And now let's look at this first point, which has been an object of major clash in this debate. Now what they've stood up and proved to you the first time is that when people go about and infringe on rights of others, then they deserve to have their rights infringed. But then when we said, well, if these people have done such horrific things, then why are we still respecting their dignity? Well, they said, well, we can take away some freedoms, but we still have to allow them their dignity. But the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, killers didn't give this kind of dignity to all these people that they massacred. They have been infringing on the dignity of so many people in our society. And we think that we need to have a severe punishment for this, because we think that respecting killers, respecting these people who have done such horrible things, is just is not going to be the adequate kind of punishment that will serve as preventative later. And so another thing that they kept bringing up is that somehow we're taking away the right to a free trial. However, in our model, we do ensure that they have a free trial. It's just that instead of life imprisonment, we're giving the judges the option to serve capital punishment. So we still have all these ethical considerations made. If they can prove that this criminal is not able to be rehabilitated, then instead of just putting them in life imprisonment, we're going to be giving them capital punishment, which we believe is going to be more successful. And so now let's look at the second question. Does capital punishment lead to societal security? And now this is something that they really didn't address. Now they have talked about how some criminals just aren't capable of being restored back into society. And we agree. Then they went on to say that the only thing that we really have left is prevention. But ladies and gentlemen, we believe that our model of capital punishment will increase prevention. Because as my first speaker mentioned, fundamental in human nature, fundamental in the nature of every animal on this planet, is the will to stay alive, the
point there.
So we think that if we can tap into this internal fear of death, then this is going to be a more effective preventative of these people committing crimes. And if we can commit these people committing crimes in the first place, then we see that our society is going to be safer. Ladies and gentlemen, what better way to keep people safe than preventing someone from committing a crime in the first place? Yes?
So one question, what are you? Are you a human being or are you alive? Just thinking about economic benefits and thinking about killing the other person to sustain yourself. You have empathy, right? You are a human, right?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think the Lions care about economic benefits. But the thing is, yes, we are human. We are thinking about the moral, we are thinking about keeping the majority safe. We are thinking about keeping our society safe. Our society, who has broken no rules, should not be under the implication to keep supporting these criminals. We think that these criminals who have broken the law in so many ways, impacted so many innocent lives, we feel that these people should have to pay the price. And we simply think that the price that they're paying under a proposition's model is not enough to justify, to serve justice to what kind of horrific things that they've achieved. And so what we would really like to see is the proposition team address the whole issue of prevention, because they've really been skirting around this topic the entire time. So now let's look at the last question. Is capital punishment more economically feasible? Now, as we've mentioned to you again and again, prison systems are incredibly expensive, and we simply don't think that it's fair that society that's been harmed in so many ways by these criminals still has to expend so many resources to be able just to keep these prisoners living in a place where they're being sheltered, where they're being fed, where they're being protected. We don't think that it's right to demand these on these people who've been impacted by these criminals in such a profound way. We think that this will serve our society better because all the things that we're doing to help these criminals will instead can be put towards helping society. And actually, your second speaker mentioned that the trial costs and the probation officers are huge costs, and they don't think that it's morally right that our society should be paying those costs. So, yes, please.
That's why we believe that, once again, it's possible that life imprisonment is okay without having a parallel appropriate punishment. Argue the motion, madam.
Well, the thing is, exactly, they're agreeing with us here. They don't think that we should be expending taxpayer dollars to provide trial officers and probation officers. So why is it then morally justified to expend tax money to provide food, to provide shelter, to provide for probation officers? If we take their logic just a little bit farther, it actually doesn't make sense that they still think that it's justified to be providing all of these things for these criminals. And ladies and gentlemen, another point that they didn't address is the mental security of our society. Now, what they seem to think is that just because you're criminals behind bars, that people are somehow just happy with that. But what we would say is that the victims of these crimes have been impacted in such a horrible and profound way. And so what we think is that, is that first of all, they feel that their money, their hard-earned money, some of it is going to help these criminals in jail. But second of all, they still feel that the punishment has not been served because these people are continuing to live. They're continuing to have this dignity that they didn't provide to these people's loved ones. And we simply don't think that this kind of mental instability is going to be fair. What we think is that our model will ensure both economic and mental security of the majority of people in our society. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is it the side opposition has brought you today? Well, we brought you a realistic model that takes some of the principles that proposition has presented and brought them a little bit further. We've shown you that because these killers haven't shown the kind of dignity that we would be giving them, that actually it's absolutely justified that we would be taking away some of these rights so that they would face the punishment that they deserve. And second of all, that this would act as a further preventative because these people know that dignity will not be waiting for them if they commit these kinds of horrendous crimes. And also, we've shown you how our model, unlike their model, actually provides the kind of security that society needs. Not only the mental security, because these people know, the victims know that their offenders are receiving a very big punishment, but also because our money isn't going to continue to support all these people who are just draining on our resources. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is for this reason that we beg to oppose. Ladies and gentlemen, life in jail is doomed to fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ending the debate on side opposition, we call the reply speaker.
Good morning once again, honorable judges, worthy opponents, and esteemed colleagues. What I'm going to do for you today in the opposition reply is look at what we think have been the three biggest areas of clash in this debate: government rights, societal security, and economic security. And then I'm actually going to show you why side opposition has come out on top of all of these ideas today. But before we move into that, let's address this first idea. Did team opposition actually address the motion today? Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we saw a proposition team that gave us an idea. We saw an opposition team that proved that this idea was not substantial enough to address the harms that we're talking about, and we instead showed you what needs to be done in order to address these harms. We'd say we did address the motion. We say we did prove that what proposition is proposing today is not going to be good enough. So ladies and gentlemen, let's now look at the three biggest areas of clash we've seen in this debate. And the first one is government rights. So does the government actually have the ability to impose the death penalty? Today, we've seen this idea on side proposition that we're ignoring the dignity of these individuals and therefore it's not fair. But we've seen a response on side opposition that really these killers haven't shown any dignity towards the victims that they've been killed. They haven't shown any dignity or respect at all, and they've infringed on the rights of many people. We don't really think it's justified or really justified in return to now show these killers, these criminals, dignity in return. Furthermore, we've seen this idea that we're fighting fire with fire, and that's not fair. We don't even think that this is an accurate representation of what we're doing. We think the individuals we're talking about have infringed on the rights of so many other people, and we are simply taking their one rights away. We think that these people have infringed on so many other people's rights that it's not even fighting fire with fire, it's simply doing what needs to be done in society. So now let's move on to the second big idea we saw today in this debate, and that's actually this idea of societal security. So we saw the big idea from proposition today that we need to ensure the safety of society. Well, we've proven pretty clearly in opposition that we're still securing the safety of society under our method, and we're actually doing it better. But the bigger issue under today has been this idea of moral societal security. Are the families going to feel justified? Are these people actually going to think it's okay that the people are still in jail? Well, proposition today has told us yes. These people are locked up. It's a done deal. However, today, opposition has given you a different perspective. Opposition has looked into the worlds of these families and these individuals who have been the victims of these crimes. And they've showed you that as long as these individuals have to live with the fact that their criminals are still alive in a jail out there somewhere, we don't think it's fair that we place that burden upon them. And we think that furthermore, we're trying to minimize the impact that we're actually, or the negative impact we're having on the victims. We don't want to make them carry any more burdens about what's happened than they have to. So ladies and gentlemen, we don't think it's fair to keep the criminal alive in jail, not only for the greater justice of society, but for the families, the friends, and the victims we're talking about. We think that's one of the biggest problems today. Now the third big idea we've seen is this idea of economic security. Now we've seen proposition admit that the jail system is going to cost more money, but they've told us again of this idea that dignity trumps money in society. So ladies and gentlemen, we've seen a response on opposition today that's realistic and that's logical. We've told you that this idea of social security and dignity for the victims is actually going to disappear. And we've told you in our second speech that what we're actually doing here is now forcing society and forcing the victims in particular to use their tax dollars to support these individuals in jail. On principle, we don't think that's fair, and furthermore, we don't actually think it's fair to society to force society to support the individuals who have been massive, huge enemies to society. We've proven that there's no chance that these individuals are going to be rehabilitated or put back out into society. We don't think it's fair that as long as they're not going to contribute to society, society should then in turn contribute to them. So ladies and gentlemen, we've talked about government rights, we've talked about societal security and economic security. We've told you why we actually have, in fact, debated the motion today, and it's for all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, that we beg to oppose and that we believe that a life in jail is doomed to fail. Thank you.
Okay, we would now call for the reply speaker of Key Government and this
Sorry, just sure. Cool. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the difference? So let me quote the third speaker. You know, like every animal in the world just is interested in sustaining itself. Ladies and gentlemen, so what's the difference between a human and an animal? We say it's like proposition, actually sustaining humanity and empathy. What actually humans just brought to create a good into their society, in Western societies. And we see it's like opposition, actually thinking, well, we are still animals and we still can kill everybody we want to as long as we think it's justice, ladies and gentlemen. So what we see is that we, as humans, have the greatest value we actually could develop through evolution, and this is empathy. This is, even though you know that somebody harmed you, you can just forgive him. You just can say, okay, even though you did something horrible to me, I see that you still have a dignity, and I don't want to kill you either, because we don't fight fire with fire, and we still see that humanity is a great good in today's world, ladies and gentlemen. So let me come to how what clashes I actually found in today's debate. So what we see is that proposition did a good job on actually showing two layers of argumentation. The first one is that we actually clashed, that we actually defend the motion right, we find the motion right, and put a burden on said opposition. So my first clash will deal with the motion and how they misinterpreted it. And secondly, I'm going to show you, so even if side proposition would stick to side opposition's definition, would stick to side opposition's motion, we would still win today's debate. So let me come to the motion clash. Just let me quote the third speaker again. She just stated the motion as this House believes that lifelong imprisonment is the best possible punishment. So we see that she just skipped in the middle of the motion, because the motion goes further and says without the possibility of peril is appropriate punishment. So what we see is that she totally neglected the second part of the motion, and this shows perfectly how the whole argumentation line said opposition was presenting us today. So what we see is that we have, as I put the burden of rebuttal there, so in my first speech, I told them that they have to defend the status quo, but criminals still get the possibility of peril. They totally neglected their burden of rebuttal, and they actually never really attacked our case we established in today's debate. So let me come to my second clash, which will deal with our sufficient case, even though we would accept their definition, ladies and gentlemen. So what we see is, as the first speaker said, opposition said today, we actually both fighting for the same values. We both fulfill we will both see that you can't just re-socialize these criminals, and we both see that you actually have to take freedom away from them to secure other persons, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm going to show you in two major questions how we actually were more sufficient doing that. At first, which solution is actually legitimate, and secondly, which solution which solution actually is what are the real aims of punishment, ladies and gentlemen. So let me come to the legitimate point. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that the social contract, that we have two major pillars of legitimacy. Firstly, the social contract, and they were just currently talking about that the victims would also be punished. Furthermore, if the people are still alive, because they see that you still get food, you still get clothes, and they're paying for it with their tax money. But ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that also victims know the dignity of person, and that also the victims don't want to fight fire with fire. They are still humans, they have still empathy, and even though what we see is they know that the prisoners can develop themselves, they have no freedom left to do anything, but they know that they're still alive, that there's the fundamental right which every human should have, which is stated in all Western societies, ladies and gentlemen, which they were the realism. What we see is that this point actually stands because all Western societies put below the fundamental value of life and dignity to a person, and we can't just take away that, even though the crime was really hard, and all families in the world and in Western societies know that and will stick to that. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come to the second pillar, the Constitution. So what we see is, the second pillar, the economic case, and I find that really horrible. You know, we're just talking about actually a medieval level of actually punishing people. What we see is that they put just economic benefits over the life of a person. They say, so we are economically sufficient, and we go and kill a person to be so economically sufficient. And we see that this is not legitimate in a Western society. This is medieval. This is not today. This is actually not feasible. And let me come to my civilization. Both agreed on that, and general and special prevention. I showed you that we also are capable of doing it. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we support the proposition.
to give you the results. Well, I'm not sure about the journal you're going to get in.
No?
Yeah, it's going to be tough, but it's easy to find us. Okay, afterwards you know our names, Elisa, Elise, Dimitri, Naya, and find us and we will give you individual feedback after like the 8th round, okay?
I'm sorry.
Don't say anything.
Oh my goodness.